Over the last 5 years, Sweden has been a country marked by high levels of violence, gangs, shootings, and no-go zones where police could not enter without reinforcements, something that would have been unthinkable not long ago. Politicians denied the situation. The media downplayed it. But behind closed doors, Swedes were losing patience. And then something happened. The Swedish Right, long considered politically untouchable, did what most Western governments said was impossible, lifting their country during one of the worst moments in its history. What follows is not a moral lesson. It is not a slogan, and it is not a simple success story. It is the step-by-step breakdown of how Sweden moved from denial to fracture to a political earthquake, and finally to one of the most drastic reversals of migration policy in the Western world. Sweden's approach to immigration was rooted in a specific historical moment. In the post-war decades, the country experienced remarkable economic growth while maintaining political stability. The Swedish model combined robust social welfare, high taxation, strong labor protections, and a commitment to internationalism. It was a system that worked because it rested on deep social trust, high levels of education, and near universal employment. When Sweden began accepting refugees in significant numbers during the 1970s and 1980s, the assumption was straightforward. People fleeing persecution would be given safety, support, and time to integrate. Language classes would be provided, housing would be arranged, the welfare state would cushion the transition, and eventually, newcomers would find work, learn Swedish, and become part of the social fabric. For years, this model appeared to function. Sweden accepted refugees from Chile, Iran, the former Yugoslavia, and Iraq. The numbers were manageable. The economy was strong. Public opinion remained broadly supportive. There were challenges, certainly, but nothing that seemed to threaten the system itself. But beginning in the 2000s, the scale changed dramatically. Between 2000 and 2015, Sweden accepted more asylum seekers per capita than any other European country. In 2015 alone, more than 160,000 people applied for asylum in a nation of fewer than 10 million. To put that in perspective, it would be equivalent to the United States accepting 5 million asylum seekers in a single year. The Swedish government welcomed this. Political leaders from both the center-left and center-right spoke proudly of the country's humanitarian tradition. When other European nations closed their borders during the 2015 migrant crisis, Sweden kept its doors open. The message was clear. Sweden would remain an exception. But the infrastructure was never built to handle this volume. The integration system, designed for a few thousand people per year, was suddenly processing tens of thousands. Language courses had waiting lists stretching months. Public housing became scarce. Schools in certain municipalities saw classrooms where Swedish was a minority language. And the labor market, with its high productivity expectations and strong credentialing requirements, proved difficult for many newcomers to enter. What Sweden didn't account for was that generosity alone doesn't guarantee integration. That providing welfare without requiring reciprocal engagement can create dependency rather than participation. And that when communities grow faster than institutions can adapt, segregation becomes the default outcome. The problems didn't appear overnight. They accumulated slowly, concentrated in specific places that most Swedes never saw. In suburbs outside Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö, entire neighborhoods transformed within a decade. Areas like Rinkeby, Rosengård, and Angered became known not for integration success stories, but for segregation, unemployment, and rising crime. By the mid-2000s, more than 80% of residents in some of these areas were foreign-born or had foreign-born parents. Swedish was rarely spoken in public spaces. Schools struggled with students who arrived with little or no formal education. Youth unemployment exceeded 40% in certain districts. These weren't just immigrant neighborhoods, they were parallel societies, disconnected from the Swedish labor market, from Swedish institutions, and increasingly, from Swedish norms. Studies showed that second-generation immigrants in Sweden had lower employment rates than their counterparts in Denmark, Norway, or Germany. Educational outcomes lagged, social mobility stalled, and then came the violence. Sweden, a country that once had one of the lowest homicide rates in Europe, began experiencing something it had never seen before. Gang shootings, grenade attacks, drug-related executions carried out by teenagers. By 2022, Sweden had the highest per capita rate of fatal shootings in Europe. Most of the perpetrators and victims were young men of immigrant background, concentrated in segregated suburbs. The Swedish police identified more than 60 areas classified as vulnerable, places where criminal networks had established territorial control, where emergency services faced hostility, and where residents reported feeling unsafe. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic failures of integration, visible proof that something fundamental had broken down. But for years, the political establishment avoided addressing this directly. To speak about immigrant crime was considered inflammatory. To question the pace of asylum intake was seen as heartless. The media framed the issue carefully, often omitting details about perpetrators' backgrounds in crime reports. Academics who raised concerns about segregation were accused of giving ammunition to the far right. And ordinary Swedes who lived in affected areas felt their concerns were dismissed or ignored. This silence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the Sweden Democrats. The Sweden Democrats were founded in the late 1980s with roots in nationalist and anti-immigration movements. For decades, they were treated as a fringe party, excluded from parliamentary cooperation, demonized in media coverage, and dismissed by every major political force. But as problems in immigrant suburbs worsened and the political consensus refused to shift, the Sweden Democrats grew steadily. Their message was simple. Sweden's immigration system was broken. Integration had failed. The country needed to close its borders and prioritize the safety and cohesion of its existing population. In 2010, they entered parliament for the first time with 5.7% of the vote. By 2018, they had nearly 18%. And in 2022, they became the second largest party in Sweden, with over 20%, making them indispensable to forming a government. What changed wasn't that Swedes suddenly became radical. It was that the traditional parties had lost credibility. Voters saw the problems in their neighborhoods, heard the nightly news reports of shootings, and watched their children's schools struggle with overcrowding and language barriers. And they concluded that the political establishment either didn't understand the reality or didn't care. The Sweden Democrats didn't need to exaggerate. The statistics spoke for themselves. Sweden had higher immigrant unemployment than comparable countries. It had more gang violence. It spent more per capita on asylum reception than its neighbors. And despite all that spending, integration outcomes were worse. After the 2022 election, the center-right coalition needed Sweden Democrat support to govern. The price was clear. A dramatic shift in migration policy, tighter asylum rules, faster deportations, reduced benefits for newly arrived immigrants, an end to the era of Swedish exceptionalism. For the first time in decades, Sweden's political establishment acknowledged that the previous approach had failed, not just partially, fundamentally. The policy changes that followed were among the most restrictive in Western Europe. Sweden tightened asylum rules to match the European minimum standards, ending the practice of offering protection beyond what international law required. Temporary residence permits became the default for refugees, with permanent residency conditional on employment and language proficiency. Family reunification rules were made stricter, and Sweden began deporting individuals whose asylum claims were rejected, something that had previously happened inconsistently. The results were immediate. Asylum applications dropped from over 160,000 in 2015 to fewer than 14,000 by 2023. Sweden went from being one of the most generous countries in Europe to one of the most restrictive. Integration programs shifted from providing long-term welfare support to emphasizing rapid labor market entry. Language requirements were introduced for permanent residents, and municipalities were given more control over asylum placements, allowing them to refuse new arrivals if local capacity was strained. At the same time, the government increased police resources in vulnerable areas, passed laws allowing extended surveillance of suspected gang members, and introduced harsher sentences for weapons offenses and violent crime. The approach was clear. Sweden would no longer accept parallel societies or tolerance of criminal networks operating with impunity. For some immigrants already in Sweden, the shift was jarring. Those who had arrived expecting long-term welfare support found themselves pushed toward employment or denied benefits. Families waiting for reunification faced years-long delays or outright rejections, and individuals whose asylum claims were deemed weak faced deportation to countries they had left years earlier. But for many Swedes, particularly those living in areas affected by crime and segregation, the changes felt overdue. They saw increased police presence in their neighborhoods. They noticed gang violence beginning to decline, and they felt, for the first time in years, that their government was taking their concerns seriously. The question wasn't whether the shift was popular. Polls consistently showed majority support for stricter migration policies. The question was whether it would work, whether Sweden could stabilize its immigrant suburbs, restore social cohesion, and rebuild trust in its institutions, and whether it could do so without abandoning its humanitarian commitments entirely. What the Swedish Right solved was political deadlock. They broke the taboo, they forced the establishment to face reality, and they implemented policies that reduced asylum intake, increased deportations, and gave law enforcement more power to confront gang violence. But what they didn't solve, and perhaps couldn't solve, were the deeper structural problems that decades of failed integration had created. Hundreds of thousands of immigrants already living in Sweden remain in segregated suburbs with high unemployment, low educational outcomes, and weak connections to society at large. Changing asylum policy doesn't integrate people who have been in the country for 10 or 15 years. It doesn't create jobs for young people with limited education and poor Swedish skills. And it doesn't dismantle the criminal networks that have been established over 2 decades. And now it's your turn. What do you think about Sweden's current situation? If you were president, would you have done the same? I'll read your comments. Remember to subscribe to our channel if you're against immigration, and see you in the next video. Have a great day.